What if I told you that one of the most famous objects ever carried into space wasn't a rocket, yes, wasn't a flag, and wasn't even a computer, but a simple mechanical watch on a human wrist? A watch that took brutal punishment, survived conditions designed to break it, and ended up becoming a tool astronauts trusted with their lives. Today, you're going to hear the full story of how the Omega Speedmaster went from racetracks to spacewalks, and finally to the surface of the moon. And stay with me, because the most intense moment in this story doesn't happen on Apollo 11. It happens when a crew is seconds away from disaster, and one watch becomes the difference between coming home or drifting into space forever. Stay to find out. Let's rewind to 1957. Omega releases a chronograph called the Speedmaster. And here's the important part. It was never intended for astronauts. It was built for speed, competition, and timing laps. You can see it in the design. It had a clean, highly readable dial. It had a tachymeter scale, but not printed on the dial like many chronographs of that era. Omega placed the tachymeter on the bezel, which sounds like a small detail, but it mattered. It made the dial less crowded, easier to read quickly, and it gave the watch a very instrument feel. A tool, a piece of equipment, not jewelry. At the time, Omega was competing in a world where chronographs were about precision and ruggedness, but nobody was thinking about outer space. Space travel was still closer to imagination than reality. Yet in the background, the Cold War was escalating, and the space race was about to explode into the world's biggest competition. Now here's where the story becomes interesting. NASA didn't go to Omega and say, "Design us a space watch." They didn't want marketing pitches. They didn't want prototypes. They wanted something they could buy like anyone else, because they needed a watch proven by real-world manufacturing, not a fragile one-off made just to impress them. So in the early 1960s, NASA quietly purchased chronographs from a range of brands, basically off the shelf, and brought them into testing. And when I say testing, I mean destruction. Not polite evaluations, not gentle lab trials. They were trying to find out what would still work when everything else failed. Because if a watch failed during a mission, it wasn't just inconvenient, it could be fatal. Stay with me, because the details of these tests explain why the Speedmaster became a legend. NASA's tests included extreme temperature swings, brutal shock, vibrations like a rocket launch, humidity, vacuum conditions, and acceleration forces that can mess with tiny moving parts. Imagine a machine made of gears, springs, levers, and oils, being forced to run perfectly while the environment is doing everything possible to make it stop. That's what these watches faced. One by one, watches failed. Crystals cracked or popped off. Movement stopped. Accuracy collapsed. Components shifted. In other words, the watches didn't just perform poorly. Many of them straight up broke. But one watch endured those punishments and kept working, the Omega Speedmaster. And here comes the official turning point. In 1965, NASA declared the Speedmaster flight qualified for all manned space missions. Think about how insane that is. A watch built for car racing is now approved for space. That qualification wasn't marketing. It was NASA saying, "We trust this thing with human lives." But before we jump to the moon, there's something important. The Speedmaster became the astronauts' watch long before Apollo 11. It went on earlier missions and got used in real conditions, in real spaceflight. So by the time the moon program reached its peak, the Speedmaster wasn't a random choice. It was the watch that had already earned its place. Now let's talk about the moon landing, because most people know the headline, but not the details. Apollo 11 in 1969 is the mission that put human boots on the lunar surface. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins. The spacecraft is a masterpiece of engineering, but it's also filled with risks. It's a machine built to do something nobody had ever done before. That means redundancy is everything. Backup systems for backup systems. So when the lunar module Eagle lands on the moon, something subtle but iconic happens. Neil Armstrong leaves his Speedmaster inside the lunar module as a backup timer, which means the first watch worn on the moon wasn't Armstrong's. It was Buzz Aldrin's Speedmaster, strapped on his wrist as he stepped down onto the lunar surface. And that's how the Speedmaster becomes the Moonwatch. But stay with me, because the moon landing is not the most dramatic moment in this story. Not even close. The true legend moment happens with Apollo 13. Apollo 13 launches in April 1970. It's supposed to be another moon mission. Not the first, not the second, not the third, but it's still huge. Because every mission carried major risks. And then suddenly everything goes wrong. An oxygen tank explodes. The spacecraft is crippled, power is limited, systems are failing, the crew is in danger, and NASA has to make decisions fast. Here's where the story becomes almost unbelievable. The crew needs to perform a precise engine burn to correct their trajectory so they can return to Earth. The problem is, the onboard computer systems are compromised, and timing that burn matters more than people realize. If you burn too little, you miss the corridor and drift off into space. If you burn too much, you re-enter at the wrong angle and burn up in the atmosphere. The margin for error is terrifyingly small. So how do you time something precisely when systems are failing? You use the simplest reliable tool you have, the Speedmaster. Astronaut Jack Swigert uses the Speedmaster to time the critical burn, about 14 seconds, that helps set them on the correct path back to Earth. Think about the pressure in that moment. You're not timing a lap. You're not timing an experiment. You're timing the difference between survival and catastrophe. That's why the Speedmaster isn't just a watch that went to the moon. It's a watch that helped bring astronauts home alive. And that's not just a cool story, NASA recognized it. Omega received the Silver Snoopy Award, which is a NASA honor given for outstanding contributions to flight safety and mission success. That award is legendary in space circles, and the Speedmaster earned it because it did what it was supposed to do when it mattered most. Now let's pause for a second and really understand why this is so impressive. The Speedmaster worn in those missions was a mechanical chronograph. No batteries, no screens, no microchips, just mechanical engineering. A mainspring storing energy, a gear train distributing it, an escapement controlling it, and a chronograph mechanism measuring time intervals. That's why this story hits so hard. The more extreme the environment, the more valuable simple mechanical reliability becomes. A device that doesn't depend on electricity is suddenly the most trustworthy piece of equipment you can have. Stay with me, because now we're going to answer the real question. Why the Speedmaster specifically? What made it survive? Part of it is the overall build quality, but part of it is design logic. The dial is readable. The pushers are usable with gloves. The case is robust. The movement can handle stress. And the watch, as a total package, performed better than others under NASA's extreme conditions. And then there's the cultural shift. Once NASA selected the Speedmaster, it became more than a product. It became a symbol. It's the watch you associate with humans pushing beyond Earth. It's linked to the moment humanity became multiplanetary, even if only briefly. That association is powerful. Not because of marketing hype, but because it was actually there. Over time, the Speedmaster evolved, but the core identity stayed the same. It's a tool watch with a story that can't be repeated. Lots of watches are inspired by aviation or inspired by exploration. The Speedmaster doesn't need inspiration, it literally lived it. And here's another retention moment. Most people think the Speedmaster's moon story is just about Apollo 11, but the reality is it's about an entire era. Gemini missions, Apollo missions, spacewalks, emergency procedures. It became part of NASA's standard equipment, not as a fashion choice, but as a survival instrument. Now imagine being an astronaut preparing for a mission. You have countless complex systems, but you also have a watch that you know has been tested to destruction, something you can trust when everything else gets weird. That emotional trust matters. And that's why collectors, engineers, and enthusiasts respect the Speedmaster. It's not only about the design, it's about the credibility, the earned story. Today, when people say Moonwatch, they're not just talking about a nickname. They're referencing one of the most verified origin stories in modern product history. A consumer chronograph that was tested by NASA, qualified, used on missions, worn on the moon, and relied upon during crisis. So when you look at a Speedmaster, you're not just looking at a nice watch, you're looking at a tiny mechanical timeline of human ambition. And now let me leave you with a final image. A human standing on the surface of the moon. No atmosphere, no wind, just silence, dust, and the Earth hanging in the distance. And on that wrist, not a futuristic device, but a mechanical watch, ticking steadily, keeping time in a place where time feels unreal. One watch, one mission, one moment that changed history forever. The Omega Speedmaster, the Moonwatch. And now you know how it reached the moon and why it mattered.